preferably directed to myself or Haley, and they'll be answered at the end of the webinar. Also afterwards, we're going to be sending out a feedback form. So if you would take a few minutes to fill that in, there's also going to be a section in there about how to access additional information about Becca's research about the community managed forests in Hawaii. And I'll pass it on to Becca now. Go ahead, Becca.
All right, aloha, my kako. Can you all hear me okay? Can you all hear me okay? Yes, okay, great. So thank you so much for being here. It's really nice to see some new and also familiar faces. And I wanted to say thank you so much for Hawaii Experimental Tropical Forests for hosting this presentation today, and in general, just supporting this work. So I am Rebekah Dickens Ohara, and I'm a PhD candidate at Purdue University in the Forestry and Natural Resources department. My doctoral advisors are Dr. Douglas Jacobs and Dr. Zhao Ma of the Forestry and Natural Resources department at Purdue, and Dr. Christian Jardina of the USDA Forest Service in Hilo at IPIF, and Dr. Laura Zanotti, anthropology professor at Purdue, are also on my committee. So my research is supported by the Tropical Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center. And my work focuses on the human dimensions of natural resource management. I'm specifically interested in understanding how community forests have emerged in various places around the globe, and how lessons across different landscapes might apply to forestry in Hawaii. I'm also interested in how the lessons learned from community-based subsistence fishing areas in Hawaii might be applied to support the development of land-based, community-based areas. Today, I'll be sharing more about community forests and highlighting a few examples from around the globe and potential pathways and opportunities for the emergence of community forests in Hawaii. After my talk, I would especially love to hear feedback from those of you who live in Hawaii and how you envision community forests supporting Hawaii's host culture and forest ecosystems. My view's a little bit messed up here. I'm gonna try and fix that. Okay. So forests shape how cultures develop, and humans are intimately connected with and reliant on forest ecosystems. They support the water we drink, the air we breathe, the animals that some of us eat, and the plants we use for medicine. They also provide a place of solitude, connection, and recreation, and can provide livelihood and subsistence opportunities for forest-dependent people. Forest ecosystems are essential for addressing issues of climate change and biodiversity loss. So finding ways to simultaneously support the health of forests and people is at the heart of community forestry, as I understand it. So why study community forests? Protected areas have often excluded people from landscapes, and they have been a common approach to forest conservation across the world. Community forests are an alternative approach that is community-based and that aims to address social, ecological, and economic needs. On a personal level, having access to forests has been a fundamental part of my life. I spent most of my childhood in Evansville, Indiana, and that's home to large soy and core farms, the Ohio River, coal mining, and some really beautiful hardwood forests. Here's the house I grew up in, and it's in a residential area, which is mostly concrete houses and really small lawns. But you'll see here is Oxbow Lake, and it was within walking distance of my home as a child. And there's about a 35-acre wetland area, which I could walk to. So for me, I spent a lot of my childhood in those woods, and it was incredibly important for me in that it provided a way to regularly connect with forests. And without that space, I wouldn't have had that opportunity. I also spent about 10 years living in Arcata, California, which is home to the Arcata Community Forest, which is over 2,000 acres and is a really wonderful recreational and watershed area that's accessible for local communities and is maintained through funding supported by sustainable logging. So in my life, I feel incredibly fortunate and privileged to have had access to forests during my childhood and throughout my 20s. And I really think it's important for everyone to be able to have access to these places. For me, community forests offer a lot of potential for strengthening forest stewardship, for improving access to forests, transmission of generational knowledge, experimentation, and sustainable livelihood development. For Hawaii specifically, I believe that community forests can be a tool for social and environmental justice, and it could provide an approach for addressing some of the harm that's been caused by colonization of Hawaii and the changes in land tenure that have had really devastating impacts for Native Hawaiian people. So my PhD research also intersects with my work as CEO of the Akaka Foundation for Tropical Forests, which is a nonprofit organization founded in honor of the late Senator Daniel K. Akaka and his legacy of supporting Hawaii's natural and cultural resources. We do this work through biocultural education, stewardship, and research. So Senator Akaka's 1992 Tropical Forest Recovery Act paved the way for the establishment of the Hawaii Experimental Tropical Forests in Laupohoihoi and Pu'uva'ava'a, and these are our geographical focal areas. So the Akaka Foundation supports the Pu'uva'ava'a community-based subsistence forest area, which is an effort to establish a community-based forest on about 80 acres of state-managed ceded lands. My research questions and approach have been really heavily influenced by my ability to be involved in this effort, which is, it's provided me with a reference point for understanding both the potential for community forests on state lands in Hawaii and also the types of questions that emerge when establishing community managed forests. So there's going to be a presentation at the 2020 Hawaii Conservation Conference by Kama'aina of Pu'uva'ava'a this fall. So if you're interested in learning more about the CBSFA at Pu'uva'ava'a, will be a really great place to learn more. The primary intention of this research is that it will be applied and useful for people interested in improving access to forests for Malama or stewardship, or improving access to food forests, culturally important plants, or just places to access and be in forests. And my hope is that this research, alongside with the work that's being done by others across the state, can really support the move towards strengthened community access to Hawaii's forests. So my research explores the following themes. First, what are the pathways and opportunities for the development of successful implementation of community forests in Hawaii? Second, how can the lessons learned from international and national collaboratively managed forests and community-based subsistence fishing areas in Hawaii be applied to the development of community managed forests in Hawaii? And finally, how is community-based natural resource management emerging in Hawaii? Before I get to my research methods, I'd like to share a bit more about what I mean when I say community managed forests, and then provide a brief overview of contemporary land tenure in Hawaii. So over the past 40 years, resource managers around the world have begun to shift away from top-down natural resource management and towards more inclusive management strategies. The increase in community managed forest is part of a larger trend towards decentralization of natural resource management and increased participation of local users that adheres to the belief that people have a right to be involved in decision-making that affects their lives. And that when local users or communities have increased access to and control of local natural resources, local communities benefit. So research from common pool resource management literature has illustrated the capacity of local communities to be successful stewards of local natural resources. And community forests are seen as a way to incorporate local knowledges, increase local participation, improve equity among stakeholders, and improve ecological and economic or livelihood outcomes. So in 2005, Glassmer and Farragon compiled a series of terms that are associated with community forests. There's a lot of different ways to talk about them, from social forestry to community-based forestry to sustainable resource management. Some other ways of referencing community forests include indigenous forests, aboriginal forestry, co-management, and adaptive management. It's hard to find one single term that really encapsulates community managed forests. There's a lot of different descriptions and definitions. So in general, though, co-management of natural resources provides a way for local and indigenous communities to bargain for more power, access, and decision-making. Colonialism has left a profound mark on indigenous communities around the world and has often disrupted customary land tenure and indigenous practice. And community forest management is one step that can be used towards rebuilding relationships with the land and improving social and environmental outcomes. Sorry, my throat's a little bit scratchy this morning. So while community-based forest management varies greatly in practice, they're characterized by inclusion of forest communities in decision-making and management. The types of community forests that I'm focused on are those that have the following traits. So first, local communities have some level of formal responsibility and decision-making over forest management. This can vary quite a bit from local communities supporting the creation of management plans to communities having complete control over the entire management process. Second, there's a component of the forest that provides some type of social or economic benefits. This can range from cultural keystone forests that provide maybe access to plants for medicinal use, or it can be food forests that provide access to subsistence needs, or it can also be the basis of a community's entire economy through sustainable logging. We'll see later an example in Mexico where sustainable logging is the foundation of one example of community forestry. Finally, ecological sustainability is a core value in community forests. The local community plays some role in stewarding the forest and ensuring that access and use is sustainable. So just to be clear, community forestry is not new, and there are countless examples of indigenous community forestry all over the world. So in an overview of community forestry, Charnley and Poe in 2007 identified 5 hypotheses that serve as a foundation for community-based forest management in both theory and practice. These include, first, that a definable community exists that can be the center of the community forest initiative. Second, some level of transfer of rights, responsibilities, and authority to the community will occur. Third, forest resources can be harvested in a way that is both sustainable and well-suited to ecological and conservation goals. Fourth, the result of increased control over decision-making and management in the hands of local communities leads to both sustainable resource extraction and healthy forest ecosystems. And finally, increased community control confers positive impacts to local communities. So in essence, community forestry really believes that communities can sustainably manage their lands and also use forest resources while maintaining ecological integrity. Now I'd like to provide a very brief overview of the context of land tenure in Hawaii before getting into my methods. So land tenure and ownership shapes forest management. Most of the world's forests are owned by governments, but private and other forms of ownership are increasing, and governments often set aside areas for use by communities. Centralization of natural resource management around the world has often been a direct result of colonization, particularly in the global South. And efforts to decentralize management have been more recently, over the last 30 or 40 years, an effort to sort of amend the problematic nature of centralization. So in Dismembering Lahui, Osorio writes that the single most critical dismemberment of Hawaiian society was the mahele, or division of lands, and the consequent transformation of Aina into private property between 1845 and 1850. In 1893, the sovereign Hawaiian nation was illegally overthrown by the Congregational Church, some non-Hawaiian residents of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and United States citizens, along with the United States Naval Forces. In 1993, the United States government acknowledged and apologized for this illegal action. However, over half of the Hawaiian Islands were ceded to the state of Hawaii or the federal government in the late 1800s. So similar to many geopolitical landscapes around the world, a strongly top-down, agency-driven approach to resource management in Hawaii has not been able to prevent the loss of native species and ecosystems over the last century. The top-down model of resource management has likewise limited the abilities of communities to fully engage both cultural and resource stewardship needs facing Hawaii. In addition to this, states just don't have adequate funding or resources to manage all of the lands under their care. So today, a majority of the Hawaiian Islands are owned by the state or are privately owned. Of the roughly 4.1 billion acres covering the major Hawaiian Islands, over 1.5 million is state-owned. The federal government owns about 530,000 acres, and the third largest landholder is Kamehameha Schools with about 360,000 acres. Ecosystems in Hawaii range from being intact to degraded to restored, and Hawaii is home to the largest number of endangered or threatened species in the United States. So it's clear that some actions need to be taken in order to support stewardship of Hawaii's forests. While community-based natural resource stewardship is an important part of Hawaiian lifeways and traditions, there are only a few contemporary public land-based community-driven stewardship efforts in Hawaii. There are examples to learn from, and there's a few highlighted here. And a good deal of research has highlighted the challenges and successes of these efforts. So the Ha'ena community-based subsistence fishing area on Kauai Island, Ka'upulehu tri-weight fisheries and reef restoration, and the terrestrial work of Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana. These all offer insights that can support our understanding of how community-based forest management might work in Hawaii. So my research hopes to integrate lessons learned from community management around the world and from community-based management here in Hawaii Islands. Let's talk methods. So this research is an example of social science, and social science can bring in different tools that help to situate forest management within the social, political, historical, economic, and ecological contexts that impact projects on the ground. So by understanding what variables tend to result in successful outcomes, social science can support and inform forest management. You can see here the structure of my research. The first chapter is a qualitative approach to understanding the context of community-based management in Hawaii. The second is a systematic literature review of approaches to integrating subsistence and livelihoods into community-managed forest programs. Today, I'm going to focus on preliminary results from these first two chapters. Take a drink of water. So for my first chapter, I will provide a synthesis of best practices and indicators of success that are found in community-based marine programs in Hawaii, such as Ha'ena. Next, I will integrate semi-structured interviews and discuss the current scope of community-based stewardship in Hawaii and the pathways and opportunities for community-based management on different land tenures, as well as perceived indicators of success and challenges of implementation. So I'm really focused on three main land tenures, and those are the three largest landholders in the state of Hawaii. So Hawaii State, Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and Kamehameha Schools. So really just like looking at those areas and seeing how might community forests emerge there. So my methods for the first chapter include a literature review of examples of collaboratively managed resource systems in Hawaii through a study of both gray literature and publications. Semi-structured interviews are being conducted as well to better understand the status of community forests in Hawaii and opportunities and barriers for their development. So interviews are focusing on current community forest programs and their leaders and decision makers, and then leaders within the largest three landowners, so state, Kamehameha Schools, and DHHL. So these are the search terms that I've used to find literature related to community-based stewardship in Hawaii for my first chapter. So each result must have at least one phrase from the first column and one from the second column. So you can see if I search for if an article has community managed forest and Hawaii in it, then it'll come up in my search result. Or if it has subsistence and Hawaiian, then it'll also come up. So that's how I've been finding my results for this first chapter. And I've gotten a ton of results, which were done in, these literature review searches were done in Google Scholar and Web of Science. Here's just a few examples of the types of literature I'm integrating into my work. And I'll just let you read that, and I'm gonna take a little breath. So you can see there's quite a few examples of research that's done in Hawaii by local people, and a lot of that is coming through in my research. So my second chapter is a systematic literature review that's focused on case studies of community managed forests that both share an indigenous context and colonial history and focus on subsistence and or livelihoods. And I chose to focus on that because I think that those contexts are really important and relatable for Hawaii. And the purpose of this is to provide a synthesis that shows approaches to integrating subsistence and livelihood as a principal feature of community forests to support future efforts in Hawaii. So this is the search term matrix for my second chapter. It's a little bit more detailed and complicated, but essentially you have 4 different variables, and it needs to have at least one term from each column. So to come up, it could say community managed forests, forest landscape, indigenous, and state owned, and then it would come up. And I use this approach in order to find similar cases that would share some context with Hawaii, and hopefully inform our work here. So inclusion criteria includes case studies of community managed forests. That's the first column. Must have an indigenous context and colonial history, because that's been an important, it's a context that really shapes, Hawaii's history. And then examples must incorporate subsistence and or livelihood as a key feature of the program. And I chose to do this because I think most of the folks I talk to here about community management are very interested in both of these things, subsistence and livelihood, and really expanding sustainable livelihood options and food security. So the goal here is to better understand how other groups have approached community forests and the role of subsistence and livelihoods in community forests. I'm asking questions such as what approaches are common, what has worked well, what are the key indicators of success and best practices or lessons learned that can be disseminated from this literature, and how might that apply to Hawaii given what we learned from chapter 1. So I'm organizing my literature review in Airtable, and I can share that after the talk if there's interest. Some themes that have emerged in my lit review thus far include the important role of nonprofits in community-based subsistence fishing areas in Hawaii. So nonprofits such as KUA have been incredibly integral to the success of the CBSFAs in Hawaii. Other results have shown that the process of setting up CBSFAs was difficult and time-consuming, and language in the laws has not always reflected community language. So, for example, in Ha'ena, when community rules were being discussed and made, the language of the community, when it was reflected in the actual laws, some authors felt like it wasn't reflective of the language of the communities. And then also there's high costs for communities in terms of time, planning, and organization. So this is just kind of a small snippet of the literature that examines CBSFAs in Hawaii. But part of my first chapter will be really exploring what local authors have already compiled together about sort of lessons learned from this process, and looking at really how can we apply that when we're thinking about applying this to forests. So far I've interviewed 7 different people, 3 of whom are state officials working for the Department of Land and Natural Resources and Division of Forestry and Wildlife, 1 person who works for the USDA Forest Service, and 3 individuals involved in community-based land management on Hawaii Island. A few emerging and common themes include there's a lot of interest at the state level. So DLNR and DOFA representatives that I spoke with are very supportive of community-based forest efforts. That said, they acknowledge there's a lack of clear pathways forward for developing community-based forests on state-managed lands. So I think that is a very heartening finding that so far everyone I've spoke to from the state, who's employed by the state, has had a lot of enthusiasm for community-based projects and a lot of willingness to work towards their realization. Secondly, there is interest at the community level in subsistence and agroforestry. So people who are involved in community-based stewardship efforts that I've spoke with have emphasized the importance of subsistence, agroforestry, and food sovereignty. They likewise have mentioned the need to integrate malama aina as a right that accompanies Native Hawaiians' rights to harvest culturally significant plant species. And this makes a lot of sense. So if you have the right to harvest culturally important plant species, it's really important to also have the right to steward those species so that you can ensure that they're abundant for harvest and just for their own existence. So next is the importance of forest accessibility for community. So for a community forest to be effective, it needs to be accessible. And then also it needs to be really community driven. So these are just some of the highlights that I've pulled from the 7 interviews that I've done so far. And I have quite a bit of work to do on this chapter still. I haven't yet had the chance to interview folks from Kamehameha Schools or DHHL. So looking forward to integrating those interviews in the future. So I just pulled a quote from one of the interviews. This is with a DOFA employee. And they said, there's definitely an interest in community forest management. We're definitely supportive, trying to be supportive. I don't know that we've exactly figured out what that looks like in every places and maybe in most places, but there's not enough resources in the state to care for these places, and we really need the community to be involved in some way. So I think that my hope is that this work will help sort of articulate some of those challenges and articulate pathways toward establishing community forests on state lands. Next, this is an excerpt or just some compilation from an interview with someone who works on a community forest project on Hawaiʻi Island. And a couple of the things that they noted was that the challenges involved is that the state moves really slowly, and that keeping a working group up to speed and engaged is challenging. There's also a lack of financial and personnel resources, which is another significant challenge. So these are all really important to be mindful of in these efforts. So this is part of the literature in my literature review. And Ayers and Kittinger write that despite the presence of enabling legislation and in some cases extraordinary community effort and collective action, co-management in Hawaii has been hindered by a lack of capacity in communities and at the state management agency, institutional culture, and rigidity at the partner resource management agency, and an ambiguous, complicated administrative rulemaking process. So this is a really important insight that can help us as we move forward to really look at this and determine how can we address this and fix it for the future. So I'm going to move on to indicators of success. And scholars of community-based natural resource management agree that the success of community-based management programs is highly contextual, and it depends on multiple intersecting factors whose level of influence is really difficult to isolate or generalize. However, we'll give it a shot. In a meta-study of 69 community forests around the globe, Pagdi et al. Identified 43 variables affecting the outcomes of CMFs. The factors that were most commonly indicated as vital for success were well-defined property rights, effective institutional arrangements, and community interests and incentives. Similarly, in Community Forestry Comes of Age, Pardo in 1995 outlined 12 indicators for success in community forestry. These include a clearly defined community, a clearly defined management area whose land is uncontested, secure tenure, and this can be in the form of land use, ownership, or tree tenure. strong institutions with the technical capacity to manage the forest and forestry-related finances, a structure for the distribution of costs and benefits, a role for forest users in rulemaking and enforcement, agreed upon management targets or objectives, economically sustainable forest units, so there's some way to subsidize the expenses involved with management, buy-in and interest by the local community, a sound management plan, a monitoring plan that addresses how to approach serious breaches, and a robust governmental commitment to the unconditional support of district forestry officers. So Pardo notes that Indigenous management practices can often be adopted with little or no modification. So it's a lot to put together, clearly, to create a successful community managed forest. There's a lot of different factors, and having this research that's already done is super helpful in helping us to get there in Hawaii. So I'm running a little short on time, so I think what I'll do is just run through maybe one of these examples of community forestry that I've studied from my literature review, and then I'll just summarize kind of the lessons learned before we go into the questions. So community forest management in Mexico. Indigenous communities in Mexico have been stewarding and using forest ecosystems for millennia. Community managed forests in Mexico is really lauded as a model for the world, and they're unique when they're compared with many other examples. Oftentimes, community management of forests is focused on non-timber forest products, but in Mexico, many community forests involve commercial timber production. So as a result of agrarian reform that accompanied the Mexican Revolution, today about 80% of forest areas in Mexico are managed by local communities, and there are about 290 to 470 community forestry enterprises. Mexico boasts the largest community-based forest timber sector in the world. And there are two types of land tenure that make up community managed forest areas, and these are ejidos and comunidades. In comunidades, communities are defined by indigeneity and long-term residency, and in ejidos, land was redistributed to landless peasants as part of the land redistribution that accompanied agrarian reform in the early 1900s. So agrarian reform has played a really important role in developing a foundation for successful outcomes in Mexico. And there have been a lot of really positive outcomes from community forestry in Mexico. There have been meaningful advances in equity, improved livelihood outcomes and employment rates, social peace, and declining rates of deforestation. There are multiple factors that contribute to the successes of community forests in Mexico, some of which are secure land tenure, strong institutional arrangements, and viable livelihood opportunities. Each of these provide a foundation for successful outcomes. Social capital has really emerged as a really important part of agrarian reform in Mexico. And the agrarian reform there really encouraged self-governance and organization. So while Mexican community forests are heralded as a model, there's still definitely unresolved issues, including illegal logging, community conflict, and corruption. But many of the factors of success articulated in the literature are seen in the Mexican examples of community forests. One example is the Ejido San Diego de Tesanes in Durango, Mexico. And this provides a really clear example of how community forests can support local communities. There's over 350 co-op members in this population of 1,600 people, and the ejido spans 60,000 hectares of land. About 26,000 hectares of those are commercial forests, which are managed by the co-op and are certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. So while the emphasis of the co-op is timber production, many local families also engage in subsistence agriculture. Outcomes from this program include 100% employment rates within the ejido. Salaries are more than threefold the region's norm. The community has pretty much eliminated poverty, and there's equitable distribution of benefits, including access to healthcare and local support for schools. Equity is seen across genders, and women represent about 40% of the co-op membership and play significant roles in timber production. So the main factors contributing to success, according to Solowski et al., include having a solid and well-defined organizational structure that includes a collective management plan and institutions that support technical decision-making, innovative forest management techniques, which include things like using bikes for harvesting and incorporating novel pay structures. Third, economic sustainability, which is supported through constantly seeking new markets for its products. And fourth, successful alliances. So the ejido has really included many different levels of government and private organizations, including high schools and universities. The co-op owns 3 sawmills and engages in timber sales and value-added products, so such as furniture, wood chips, and bark. They have also begun promoting ecotourism within the ejido. So this is a really good example of a very successful community forest program, and land tenure has a lot to do with that, as does having structures for timber production. Let's see. So I'm actually running out of time here, so I'm going to skip these other examples and just talk a little bit about how we might apply this research that I'm doing and bring it together to support community forests in Hawaii. So clearly land tenure plays a really central feature in opportunities. And when considering the design of community forests in Hawaii, in light of the commonly accepted indicators of success, it's really clear that land tenure is one of the most fundamental indicators for how community forests can develop. So the reality of land tenure in Hawaii and the lack of processes for devolution of control to local communities makes the lessons of Mexico's community forests a little bit difficult to emulate in the absence of significant changes to land tenure in Hawaii. That said, one possibility that's emerged from my interviews with DLNR officials is the creation of community-based leaseholds on state lands. So if this process were clarified and if timber leases were able to be instituted, lessons from Mexico and the Philippines, whose community forests operate through long-term leases on state-owned lands, would be more applicable to the Hawaiian Islands. And I think these examples are really important because they really show the value of community forests for supporting sustainable livelihood options, which is a really important need here. Let me see here. I'm cutting out some things because I have just another minute that I want to talk. So the experiences also, which I didn't touch on here today, of Nepal and India, also really highlight the importance and value of indigenous knowledge and local decision making. And I know that there's been some discussion among leaders within DLNR related to designating cultural stewardship areas. So I think this approach is really within the realm of possibility. And I'm going to stop it there. I have a little bit too much to say about this topic, and I'm sorry for going over, but I'd really like to get to your questions, and I'll just offer that I have included sources here, but there are quite a few too many, so please reach out to me if you'd like a list of my sources, and I'd be happy to share them with you. And I'm gonna hand it back over to Tabby or Haley to help us with the questions.
Hello. Hopefully people can hear me. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to put those either in the chat or at this point you should be able to unmute yourselves and ask a question if you would like. I think there is a question in the chat. So Kevin Chang said, mahalo, Rebecca, this is great. And that it's a very great and informative talk. He says, we have visited some of the Ejido in Mexico. The Mayan community in Felipe Carrillo Puerto is also building ecotourism and honey-making enterprises. Rebecca, did you do any research on the number and kinds of community stewardship agreements there are?
I'm not sure if this is speaking to the number of community stewardship agreements in Hawaii or in Mexico, but I will just, I'll try to answer both. So I know in Mexico, there's a lot. There about 80% of forest lands are owned by communities and managed by communities in Mexico. So it's very widespread, and there's examples in Mexico of really successful approaches to community forests. And then there's also, of course, examples where maybe only one of the desired outcomes is achieved. So usually with community forestry, we're wanting to see ecological, social, and economic outcomes. And it's hard to always get all three at the same rate, but I think a lot of the different examples in Mexico have shown sort of the wide diversity, and some examples really show hitting the mark on all three, and others show, you know, oh yeah, we've really improved the sustainable livelihoods option, but the, you know, maybe the benefits weren't equitably distributed. In terms of Hawaii, that is part of my research, is to really understand the breadth of community-based terrestrial programs in Hawaii. So I'm really just scratching the surface of that still. In terms, I think there's a lot of examples of community-based volunteer programs and things like that. There are less examples of community-based forests that kind of touch on all of the things I was talking about earlier, like devolution of control to the community and real decision-making by the community. So that's what I'm really trying to understand, sort of the breadth of that. So if anyone has examples of that they know of, please do share that with me, because I'm on little Hawaii Island, and you know, I know there's a lot happening on the other islands that I'm not aware of. So I hope that kind of answered that question.
All right, so there are more questions in the chat. Jasmine asks, this is very interesting research. Do you currently have plans to implement it eventually?
Yes, so I'm really fortunate through my job to support the community-based subsistence forest area in Pu'uva'ava'a, and that's an effort that's growing, and yeah, so it's it's definitely being implemented. You know, not by me, but I'm like a small support to that project. And it's really awesome to witness it. And then I'm hopeful that this research really can sort of help to articulate what are the pathways and what are sort of the gaps that we need to address, so that if a community group wants to establish a community-based forest area, they will have the tools and knowledge of how to do that. So I think, you know, there's a lot to learn from the community-based subsistence fishing areas here in Hawaii. They've already done that process and established a process. So while it may not be simple, there is a clear path towards establishing community-based subsistence fishing areas. And my hope is that this work, alongside the work of a lot of other people that's happening in Hawaii, will support sort of a clearer articulation of what it looks like to create those.
All right, so the next question is from Kevin Chang, and it says, we would be interested in the language of those agreements, how they differ and how they can be improved.
I'm not sure I know what agreements you're talking to, Kevin.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll give you a chance to respond. Oh, Hawaii community-based stewardship agreements. You know, let me follow up on that. Let me think about this question for a second. Let me see if I can find it in here and read it. The language of those agreements and how they differ and how they can be improved. Oh, gotcha. Okay, so yeah, that's definitely something that I'll be exploring. I don't think I've done enough work in that area to really speak well to it right now, but yeah, I'll get back to you on that, Kevin.
All right, and so then the next question is from Heather McMillan, who says, from my limited experience within DOFA, I have observed and expressed, as you mentioned, an interest and a willingness on the agency's part for community managed forestry. Might one of the challenges be that community members assume there is no support or interest to have these kinds of discussions, or that they are just tired by the prospect of working through the administrative marathon? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes, I totally think that is a reality. I think that there are a lot of people in Hawaii thinking about access to forests and stewardship and sustainable livelihoods. And I don't think there's a clear pathway for it. And I don't think it's clear like how the state would support that. So that's really the goal of my work, is to try and figure that out. You know, I've been studying this for a little while and it's still not totally clear to me. So that's really the intention behind this work, is to help clarify that. And I'm hoping that we can kind of answer those questions in terms of where are the gaps in that process, and how can we kind of manage those gaps, you know, between local community members and, you know, stakeholders like the state or KS or DHHL.
All right, your next question is from Chelsea Silva. They say, hi Becca, excellent presentation. I am curious about the involvement of U.S. Forest Service in these partnerships. I know in the Western U.S. they are becoming more involved with collaborative forest planning.
Yes, so the U.S. Forest Service is part of the HUI that's supporting the Pu'uwawa Community Subsistence Forest Area. So there is involvement in terms of, for that one project. In terms of larger involvement, the U.S. Forest Service doesn't really own land in Hawaii. It's a little bit different than on the continental U.S. So it's a little bit different here, but I do know that there is grant funding available for community forests that applies to Hawaii from the U.S. Forest Service, and there's also a pretty high degree of interest by the U.S. Forest Service employees that I know and work with at IPIF who are very interested in supporting these kinds of community-based efforts. So it's really cool to see that momentum building. Yeah.
All right, so the next question is for me, actually. It says, Haley, will you be sharing the recording from this? So yes, we will be sharing the recording afterwards, and we plan on sending an email out to everybody who signed up via the Eventbrite with the link to the video once it's published online. All right, so then the next question is from Irene Sprecher. So it says, great presentation, Rebekah. Thanks for sharing. We are working on a DOFA SOP for stewardship agreements. It would be great to have you take a look at it at some point.
That would be amazing. Great.
All right, so then the next one is from Katie Friday. They say the USFS doesn't own land in Hawaii, although we do have a lease on state land, the HUTF, where Becca's project is working. And certainly the USFS research has been working closely with Becca. The USFS State and Private Forestry Program does offer grants. The USFS Community Forest Program recently helped with the Friends of the Amy D.H. Greenwell Garden to purchase that garden. Our grants to DOFA can support community forestry in a variety of ways. That's not a question, it's just a comment.
Thank you, Katie.
So Natalie says, mahalo, Rebekah. How is the governance structured for the Pu'u Va'ava'a CDSFA to ensure community decision-making power, i.e. advisory board, lease, or license agreement?
Hi, Natalie. So I think that I hesitate to talk too much about the CDSFA at Pu'uvava because it's something that I feel that at the Hawaii community or at the Hawaii Conservation Conference in the fall, Kama'aina from the area are really going to be speaking in detail to the project. But I will say that the community leadership for the project is led by Hannah Springer, Kulule Keakealani, and Katie Kamelamela. And the first two mentioned are Kama'aina of Pu'uvava and Pu'uanahulu. And they are really the leaders. So there are a few different structures for that community forest program. There are really three different hui. There's the hui Kaia'ulu, which represents the really the community and the community leaders. And that's really led by Hannah Springer and Kulule and Katie. And then there's also, and they are really at the center of decision making. So they go back to community members and sort of talk with local community members to get their insights. And they've really led this project. Then there's the Hui Pulo, which is the agency hui, and they meet separately and also with the larger group. And the role of the agencies is really to support the community-based efforts. So, and the Akaka Foundation as a nonprofit is kind of included in that agency hui. And so our role is really to support the goals of the community forest and the goals of Hui Kaia'ulu. And then there's the Hui Nui, which is pretty much everyone who's active in the project, and that's the large group. And so we come together monthly or every couple of months and meet and talk about goals. And there is a relationship document that was authored by Auntie Hannah Springer, and that's really guided our relationships. And and sort of our different roles in this project. So I think that in terms of community decision-making power, I think it's pretty strong in this project, but I also think that I'm not the best person to speak to it right now. I think you'll probably learn a lot more at the Hawaii Conservation Conference.
All right, awesome. I have been informed that I missed a question. So this is from Chris Kramer, and they say, in a community-based forest where there is no kaiai, we are seeing a lot of rubbish, fires, random shooting, and cutting down of native trees. Have you heard of examples where this can be reversed?
Yeah, so I think I've read about examples in Mexico where community-based forests have really helped to spearhead improve stewardship and sort of curtail illegal logging. So I think that, especially from the literature I've read, especially when rules are defined by communities and there's that local community decision-making power affecting the forest area, I think that really contributes to sort of adherence to rules. So when you're part of a decision-making process and you believe in that decision-making because you've seen, you know, your community come together to make those decisions, I think people, and the research shows that people are a lot more likely to follow rules and guidelines, you know, when they help to create those rules. So to me, having community-based structures that are and institutions that are driven by local communities really supports and promotes stewardship and can help deter sort of things like seeing rubbish and random shooting and that kind of thing. Yeah, thanks for your question. I think that's a really important aspect of this.
All right, so it looks like there is one more question from Cowie Lucas. Who at U.S. Forest Service would one talk to in Hawaii? And somebody has put an answer in the chat, but I'll give you a chance to answer first, and then I can read out.
Oh yeah, I think Katie's response is perfect. So Susan Cordell is the head of IPIF, the director, and she's a really good person to contact. Katie Friday is very involved in these kinds of efforts, and also Christian Jardines at the Forest Service is a research ecologist who is very interested in supporting community-based stewardship efforts.
All right, so that is the last question we have in the chat, and we are already 5 minutes over time. So we are probably going to try to end it here, but we are going to send out a feedback form. I'm going to put it in the chat now, but we will also send it out as an email later. We hope that you guys enjoyed our first webinar. There will be another one to come in July. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you everyone so much for joining. I really appreciate this opportunity. And please do send your email along with the Google form if you'd like to either get updates about my research as it progresses, or if you would like to share any feedback that would help support the research, because I'm still very much in the midst of it. Mahalo nui.